Seen Charley Varrick?
You're an interesting man, Mr. Varrick. Last of the independents.
Oh, my God. You want to die for somebody else's money?
$500,000?
Could be.
Harold Young, Trace Cruise's bank manager, has estimated that the bandits escaped with less than $2,000.
Who are they kidding, us?
It's 10 to 1. This stuff belongs to the Mafia. This is gambling money, skimmed off the top. The Mafia kills you. No trial, no judge. They never stop looking for you, not till you're dead. I'd rather have 10 FBI's after me.
One man against the Mafia.
Bang! This little bank a million miles from nowhere gets hit by 4 professionals. Now they're going to think that's strange.
Why couldn't it be just a coincidence?
Because they don't believe in coincidence.
Crop dusters don't wave guns. Put that thing away fast.
But we're gonna get them. I'll never get out of New Mexico. I feel that in my gut.
Might want to fence off some money. Hot, burning up.
What do you want?
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to scare you. Which doesn't mean I won't throw you right out that window if I have to.
Sooner or later, you're gonna tell me everything you know. So why not save yourself a great deal of pain? Where's Charles Varrick?
When Charley Varrick runs out of dumb luck, he always has genius to fall back on.
Working with Don Siegel was a joy. And in a way, it spoiled me because I thought all filmmaking was going to be like working with Don.
In working on Charley Varrick, being a visual person, I had a certain idea of what the film was going to look like. And knowing Don Siegel, there are very few Don Siegel movies I've seen through the years that I haven't really enjoyed because he's a storyteller. You know, unfortunately today, it's not so much about the story, it's how much CGI can you pack into something.
Whether it's Charley Varrick, which is the title it was released under, or Kill Charley Varrick, which is one of the European titles, or Last of the Independents, which is what Don wanted to call it. The finished film has its moment, you get what's going on, and you're out. You know, it's an economy that is very much a kind of Don Siegel economy, and it's the kind of thing that I think American movies used to know how to do. They were lean, spare, and didn't really give you anything that they didn't have to give you.
Don Siegel would walk onto the set and he would have the entire film in his head. He knew exactly almost every frame of the film.
I like the Don Siegel who tells the truth, has a really interesting view of humanity, has a peculiar kind of austere style, both as a director, but I think also about what the truth was in a scene, you know, cuts out the sentiment, goes straight to story. That's what I love about Don Siegel. My name is Christopher Tabori. I'm Don Siegel's son. He was married to my mother, Vivica Lindfors. They met at Warner Brothers doing a pretty interesting film, and she immediately fell in love with my father, which was great because it produced me, I guess. It was my mother's first film in the United States, but the third film to be released because the studio was worried that Ronald Reagan was going to get blacklisted. So that's an interesting bit of something or other, given where Ronald Reagan ended up on the political scale. When Charley Varrick was being made, I was working as a young actor and doing quite well, quite successful, toggling between New York and Los Angeles, and obviously when I was out here, I'd see my dad. I remember him being very excited about this film. Charley Varrick was produced after Dirty Harry, so it was sort of in his golden age where his work was being taken seriously and he had a little more control.
The first project my dad worked on with Don Siegel was a policier called Madigan, and it was where his relationship with Don was formed, which was both a very satisfying relationship and a very tempestuous one. Madigan was about the police commissioner of New York and his trusted lieutenant and a kind of flashy, slightly corrupt cop, played by Richard Widmark. The commissioner himself was played by Henry Fonda. It was a great cast, based on a really good, tough, gritty novel called The Commissioner. But at a certain point, my father either was onto another project, or Don decided he couldn't do any more on it, or my dad walked away. And so my dad recommended Abe Polonsky, who was a friend of his, who was a blacklisted writer and director. But just before the film came out, my father said, take my name off, I'm using my pseudonym. His pseudonym was Henri Simoun, Simoun being a hot wind. And in fact, his pseudonym, Henri Simoun, appears on a huge number of things. So they worked together very happily on Madigan when they weren't fighting. And as a result, they worked together on another film called Coogan's Bluff. Coogan's Bluff was also policier. It's about an Arizona cop played by Clint Eastwood who comes to New York to extradite a prisoner who escaped from his custody. The New York cop, played by Lee J. Cobb, doesn't like him, doesn't really understand him, keeps saying, this isn't your town, Tex. And Clint Eastwood, of course, keeps saying, Arizona.
My first collaboration with Don Siegel was around 1968 in a movie he directed called Coogan's Bluff. First of all, I was inhibited because I was overwhelmed by his presence. And I did tell him this afterwards, I didn't really understand the film too well. I mean, I understood the whole thing but there were some sequences and some scenes that I didn't know he had a way of shooting people faces that they were strange to me. Obviously I was wrong, but I kept going and I did it. Also at the time of Coogan's Bluff, I met Clint Eastwood, who was very important in the whole history of Don Siegel's films. Clint Eastwood was one of the main actor, I think. He was a very nice guy. He loved music. As a matter, he did like jazz, so I felt very comfortable with him.
I met Don Siegel through his son, Chris Tabori. Chris Tabori and I were colleagues in New York theater. We'd done some work together. And Don came to New York and asked, when Don was casting, looking for the killer in Dirty Harry, he asked Chris, with Don's typical irony, who's the best actor in New York? And Chris, I don't know, Chris must have been stoned or something, said that Andy Robinson was. And so that's how I got a meeting with Don. And at the time, I was doing a play at the New York Shakespeare Festival, but Don couldn't come and see it. And so we had this meeting, and Don said, I'm sorry, I can't see your play, but my son tells me you're a terrific actor, and that was pretty much the meeting. And I thought that was it. And then a couple of weeks later, Clint Eastwood came to the play, and then I got hired to do Dirty Harry.
Andy comes out of Greenwich Village and East Village Experimental Theater. He was working at places like Cafe La Mama. And when he kind of got discovered and brought out to Hollywood. I think what really accounted for his career was really the two Don Siegel films, Dirty Harry and Charley Varrick. Very different parts, very different portrayals, and Andy has the ability to disappear into a part. So if you look at him in Dirty Harry, you think he's really like that guy. But then I saw a TV movie in which he played Liberace impeccably. I think Andy's Liberace is as good as the Michael Douglas Liberace.
But then Don, when after the screening, said to me, laughingly, in that, again, ironic way of his, he said, I've probably ruined your career. And I laughed. I thought he was being just Don. But in a way, it's not that he ruined my career, but certainly it was hard for anyone to see me as other than a psychopathic killer. So Thankfully, the next film that I did was Charley Varrick. Don hired me again the following year. And when he called me about the film, he said, listen, this guy he's not a choir boy, but he's not crazy. He's just a regular, good old, greedy kind of bank robber sort of person. But I was pleased because I loved working with him, and I was overjoyed to work with him again.
To work with Andy Robinson, I just befriended him immediately. He's a very intelligent man, a very fine actor, and Don adored this guy. There was no way Andy was not going to be in this movie after Dirty Harry.
The third film that my dad worked on with Don Siegel was Charley Varrick. Charley Varrick is based on a book called The Looters by John Reese. Universal did a lot of that. They optioned books that they thought would make, good movies. I mean, I don't think they were at that time calling them B movies, but they were. In the same way that they had optioned The Commissioner by Richard Doherty, they optioned The Looters by John Reese. And my father's task was to adapt the book. I've read the book, although not for a while. The book is a nice little tough neo-noir. I think more like people like Lionel White and Peter Rabe than people on the level of, Goodis or Thompson or Richard Stark. But it's the kind of book that filmmakers can make really nice films from. I think of Lionel White's Clean Break that became the Kubrick movie The Killing, or the Dolores Hitchens novel Fool's Gold that became Band of Outsiders. It's that kind of a book. There's enough there so that a filmmaker with a vision can make something pretty cool out of it. My father said that when it was originally contemplated, it was going to be a pretty rough and tough movie, which I think it still is. And it was going to be with Donald Sutherland. And one of the exhibitors called up and called someone at Universal, who called somebody else and said, Radio City Music Hall needs a movie for Easter. So if it's a movie for Easter, it has to be, at least in some sense, a family entertainment. And they felt they could accomplish that by replacing Donald Sutherland, who was a kind of wonderful, edgy, off-center actor of enormous talent, with Walter Matthau, who was at least up to that point considered a family-friendly actor of enormous talent. My father had his doubts about whether Walter Matthau, who he thought of as a kind of warm, fuzzy guy who had a very wry sense of humor. And you can certainly see that in his work with Wilder. You can certainly see that in his work in something like Charade. My father had his doubts as to whether Walter Matthau could step up to a part that, at least as he envisioned it, was pretty dark.
When Donald Sutherland fell through, I was really happy to hear that Walter Matthau was going to do it, because as far as I was concerned, he was a real screen giant. People who don't know Walter's career think that it was unusual for him to play Charley Varrick, but if you look at his earlier career, he played several villains. It's common knowledge, everyone knows that Walter had a gambling habit, and it was a serious habit that he had to control. And one day I said to him, how did you ever become a star? Because you're a great actor, but you're a character actor. You do these various characters, and you don't look like Clint Eastwood or Paul Newman or any of those guys. And he says, well, I'll tell you what. I became a star because one day I got a call from my bookie. And my bookie said, Walter, what do you want? You want your arms broken or your legs broken? So Walter, at that point, realized that he had to come up with a lot of money fast. And so he said he took every job that was ever offered to him. And if you look at old television series, American television, he'll pop up as the bad guy. And so when it came time to Charley Varrick, I mean, he was a great actor. Of course, he was a comedian. He was a light comedian. He had finesse. He had such grace and ease in front of the camera. But he could also he was also a very serious actor.
My father, when he saw the finished film, was knocked out by Matthau's performance because the hard edge was there. in a way that I think we've rarely seen from Matthau before. But also the heart of Matthau really makes you root for that character, even when he's doing pretty despicable things. And that's a hard line to find, and I think Matthau found it, and my dad was very happy that he did. He was ready and poised to take his name off again, but when he saw the film, said, no, I'm proud of this, which for him was very rare.
We were on the set of Charley Varrick, and this blonde, long-haired guy with a beard walked up to me, and he introduced himself, and when he said Michael Butler, I said, you're the DP? Strikingly good-looking guy. And he was brilliant. He was a brilliant DP. He's a lighting DP. I mean, that's an art. You know, like Vittorio Storaro, I did like 4 films with. Michael was every bit as good as Vittorio. And Michael was Don Siegel's godson, you know, but he wasn't hired because he was his godson. He was hired because he was a very, very good DP. And I feel lucky to have worked with he and Don on the same picture, because you were part of their family. And they made magic.
Watching the movie last night and trying to distill what it was that really made this movie, I think, a remarkable film, a seminal movie in its genre, which is, you know, sort of what, crime drama, anti-hero crime drama. First off, the setting is fantastic. You're immediately in both a normal and dangerous world. You just feel it right from the start.
The credits to the film are all it's sort of like this bucolic, easy rhythm of sprinklers going off, kids running.
It's sort of hokey America, Midwest, and yet there's a kind of odd, discordant feel to it. You know, clearly you're watching a Don Siegel film, you know something bad is going to happen.
It's in the countryside in Nevada. It's very sweet. And then there's this, you know, gentle music, Lalo's Schifrin's gentle music.
He sets the tone beautifully, you know, and his ability, for all his control and, you know, enormous specificity as a director. And it's interesting reading Don's notes in his book, his ability to use what happens. You know, they're off doing camera tests and they start shooting my little brother and little sisters, you know, running through fountains and, you know, mowing lawns. And then that great shot, I had no idea that it was Walter Matthau's son trying to put the saddle on the burro. It's just gorgeous stuff.
And then this yellow car shows up and pulls up in front of a bank. The bank where we shot was in this little, very small town. I mean, barely a town. I mean, if you were driving through, if you closed your eyes, you'd miss it.
A little old, sleepy, lazy town called Minden, Nevada, just outside of Carson City.
But there was this little bank there. It was a real bank. And it was really quite near where the actors, where we stayed, where we were living. I remember that Jacqueline Scott, who played Charley Varrick's wife and who was driving the car, Nadine, that's right, Nadine. And we, you know, it's like that was the first scene we shot. So we'd all just met each other. And it's like one of those things, you just meet each other, okay, let's go to work, you know, and so it's always, and beginnings, as Confucius says, are hard. But Jacqueline was a very, very sweet woman, lovely woman, totally without ego.
My God, you know, this is the first time I finally got to work with Walter Matthau, because I just idolized him as an actor. He says, Jackie, you're a good actor. And after that, you know, his attitude toward me was totally different. Well, that made me feel good.
And then, bam! Once they get inside that bank, the rhythms completely change. I mean, the cutting, the violence of the editing, and of what happens. and how people rob banks.
Ingmar Bergman said that filmmaking is very similar to magic. You have to make believe things. And in this case, we have to make believe that there was a complete, and it was, a complete change of the atmosphere, abrupt. There was no transition, it was abrupt.
The hardest thing for me to do physically in that film was when I jumped through the teller's window. And I was wearing these cowboy boots and these tight corduroy pants. And it was like, it was terrible. And then in one take, my ass, the ass of my pants, totally ripped out.
When the cop was shot in the face, the guy who actually shot him was lying in the back seat of the car. And, you know, he shot him right between the eyes. And with a blood pellet would explode once he hit it. But to see guns and all those fake bullets and stuff like that, they can hurt you. I mean, that guy had a bruise on his face for the rest of the week while I was there.
By the way, it's not an opening sequence. It's the first act. It goes all the way to 30 minutes into the film. The first 30 minutes are the bank robbery and the aftermath of the robbery. And that's really remarkable.
Charley discovers that Nadine is mortally wounded. And there's a moment there, a very sweet, gentle moment between Charley and Nadine.
When you look at how his wife dies and that moment he has with her, it's without sentiment. It's with emotion, but it's without sentiment. And that I thought was a very interesting choice. That's a real Don Siegel choice. That is a real Don Siegel choice. And that, you know, I think that's what makes Don Siegel films interesting, is that he gets to that precipice and he finds a really interesting way to navigate around that scene so that we're watching it differently.
When Walter took the ring off my finger, that was my own wedding ring.
I said, you want me to go down this road 100 miles an hour and snap a 180? And then Paula says, do you think you can do it? Well, I said, okay. And we set it up. They had the cameras inside, and I took off flying down this highway. And I locked it up, going straight. And then you see the car just snap and come around. Thank God it stayed on the road, and I came back after him.
We're in the middle of the scene, and bang. But of course, obviously, you know, the bang happened. You know, the real bang happens when they're shooting across the van and Charley and the cop, and you see the explosion in the background. That explosion was, you know, setting that up was very delicate because they had to do it. You know, obviously they were in contact with each other over walkie-talkies and whatever. And plus, there was a load of fire people because we were shooting in the summer. It was dry, and really it was a real explosion. So basically, they had to be prepared for any fire that would happen.
The blowing up of the car, you know, that great, you know, ticking bomb, you know, where they set it up that it's going to blow. We're waiting for it to blow. We don't understand why it hasn't blown, right? And then they get stopped by a cop car. Oh my God, if that thing blows, we're really going to be in trouble. And then how brilliantly it becomes a comic device for the cop to go, the problem's over there. And it actually saves them. You know, that's really brilliant filmmaking. You know, I was in awe. I was in awe.
It was an entirely different working experience with Walter. Walter came from the theater, as I did. And Walter liked to rehearse. And we were constantly running lines a lot. Don didn't like to rehearse that much. Don would rehearse, but only to get the camera angle, you know, to make sure that the lighting was correct. He always told me what's going on in the frame. That was his direction. He never told me how to play the character. You know, when I came up with an idea that he liked, he went with it. If it was an idea that he didn't like, he'd say, no, don't do that. So Walter and I would go off, and we would go back and forth with the scene. There was not a lot of improvisation because the script was really very tight. I think the script was extremely well written. When you're working on a character, you're looking for that trigger. You're looking for the motor for that character. And here's this kid who's white trash, good-looking kid, not very bright, gets a job as a crop duster, falls in with this guy, Charley Varrick. They figure they need some money. They'll knock over this bank, get maybe a few $1,000s. And this is a kid who's had nothing all his life. And then suddenly there's this enormous amount of money. It would, in today's dollars, it would have been millions of dollars. And of course, it just turns him around. I mean, he's absolutely blinded by this. It was like a screwball comedy without the comedy. And in a sense, yes, I was his Jack Lemmon. But it was easy to be his partner because he gave so much. He really spoke to you. He listened. He was a consummate actor. He understood what the craft was about.
For me, the movie is about a guy navigating himself out of a problem that he didn't know he created for himself and finding a more brilliant way than we would ever expect or we can anticipate for him to navigate himself out of it and not lose the money, right, which is the goal in the film. Part of what's great in the movie is that he's got a double threat. He's both got the legit people after him and he's got obviously the mafia after him. And I thought all the little touches of planning, of detail, gave it so much vitality. I mean, you could have done that sequence of a bank robbery and blowing up the car and their escape. I guarantee you could have done it in 5 minutes. It's more than just the tease to get you into the movie. It's a highly complex event in which he sets up, the problems between Andy Robinson and Walter Matthau, all sorts of aspects of Mathau's character, this kind of strange, both brilliant but disconnected guy. It's like he's cut off on some level. So he's a perfect Don Siegel hero. The introduction of John Vernon and Joe Don Baker and how they get integrated in the story is brilliant. By the way, the one thing absolutely has to be acknowledged in this movie, because it's a real Don Siegel infusion, is the fact that nobody in the mafia is Italian. That he used Benson Fong, who owned the famous restaurant here in Los Angeles, as one of the mafia guys, and John Vernon, who's like, Mr. White Guy, and there's Biff Parfrey with the English accent, and it was such a conscientious choice, and again, I thought a very clever one, and finally to have Joe Don Baker be the hitman, that was and brilliant, and giving him the pipe, which was a Don Siegel pipe.
Shooting that scene with Joe Don Baker in the trailer was horrendous. I hated doing that scene. It was like basically just sadomasochism. I mean, from the time he opens the door, lets the guy in, and then it's just an execution, a slow, torturous execution. I'll never forget that night because we shot all night long until the dawn, and I was so sore because I like as in Dirty Harry, I did my own stunts. I was very young and limber and strong and acrobatic. And Don loved that. He didn't have to get a stuntman. And we did it over and over and over again, and it was like miserable. And I didn't have much of a relationship with Joe Don. I mean, he was a guy who kept his own counsel and whatever. So it wasn't necessary. Whereas it was a wonderful exchange that Walter and I had. But in terms of Joe Don, the exchange was very different.
I remember that I had to come with a team that would convey. The only thing I could convey was Charley Varrick's mind. Because he doesn't talk to anybody. He doesn't say, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. He doesn't say anything. So I came with a pulse. The mind is working. The mind is working. And every time that you hear that pulse, which was one of an instrument invented here in Hollywood by Hollywood musicians, percussionists, it's called flapamba, which is a mixture of marimba and I don't know what. It's a very interesting sound. It was very interesting. And I used it. And Don liked it, obviously. There's only one character. It's Charley Varrick.
The end sequence in the junkyard with the biplane, Don came up with this idea, which I thought was brilliant, that it takes place in this junkyard. So what they did, they rented a real junkyard. And we started filming, and we had to go away and shoot something else, and we were going to go back. But the owner of the junkyard said, oh, no, you want to come back to my location? You're going to have to pay me 3-4 times what you paid originally. So it was basically highway robbery. And Don Siegel looked at his first director, Joe Cavalier, who was brilliant, consummate first AD, and said, listen, that's my location. We're supposed to have that locked up. Joe said, don't worry about a thing. We're not going to pay a penny for that location. So Joe went and got transportation, and they rebuilt that junkyard on a different spot. It wasn't the same junkyard. You see 2 different junkyards in the movie. Paul had hired probably the finest stunt pilot in the history of cinema, a guy named Frank Tallman.
Frank Tallman, who was legendary, who did all of the great airplane stunts in Hollywood.
And Frank was doubling Walter Matthau, and he was supposed to ground loop this biplane, which Don Siegel said, listen, I can't spend all day doing this. How difficult is this, to Frank? And Paul said, give him a rehearsal. So Frank went and got in his biplane and came flying up this road and ground looped it, flipped it right on top. And Paul says, is that good enough to Don? Don said, okay. So they righted it, didn't damage it at all. And they did the same thing in the movie.
Originally, the film was called The Looters. And then Don wanted to call it The Last of the Independents. And the studio wouldn't let him, because now that they had Walter Matthau, who was a big star, they wanted to call it, obviously, Charley Varrick.
One of the things that I like best about the film Charley Varrick is the way that it really assumes that the audience is smart, assumes that if you hold the audience in your grip well enough, there will be things that you don't understand the first time around, but that you have enough faith that you will understand them either by the time the film's over or upon a second viewing. One of the things that I try to teach my screenwriting students, and one of the things I try to do in my own work, is you want to write a film that viewed forward is continuously surprising, and viewed backward seems inevitable. That's really, really hard to do, and I think Charley Varrick is one of the few films that actually, in its own quiet way, hits those marks impeccably. As you're watching it, there are little pieces of exposition that you don't know are exposition. There are little plot twists that you're not aware are plot twists. But then at the end, all of a sudden, there's the trunk and there's the bomb, and you get it. And all of it falls together, and you realize the motivation for all of those 4 or 5 little things that you didn't quite understand. It's like, oh yes, that's what he was doing. And then you're happy, and then the movie ends.